Sometimes the bonds that keep us alive are the very ones that destroy us. In the Colorado Territory, Magnus Thorne learned this truth the hardest way possible. The mountain man lived alone, feared by the townsfolk who called him a savage. When his sister Clara returned after 15 years, people began to whisper. They saw how close the siblings were, how they depended on each other. The gossip spread through Cedar Ridge like poison. Magnus and Clara had survived things no person should endure. They only had each other in a land that showed no mercy. When Clara became pregnant, the town exploded with outrage. Everyone demanded to know the father. But the truth about Magnus and Clara was darker than anyone imagined. What really happened during that brutal winter that tore their family apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks of the Colorado Rockies like memories that refused to fade. Magnus Thorne stood 7 feet tall on his cabin porch, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising in the crisp mountain air. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to depend on no one but himself. His cabin sat perched on a natural shelf of granite, commanding a view of the entire valley below. Cedar Ridge looked like a child's toy set from this distance. Tiny buildings scattered along the creek, smoke rising from chimneys as the town stirred to life. Magnus preferred it this way, watching civilization from afar. Close enough to trade his furs and meat when necessary, far enough to avoid the judgmental stares and whispered conversations that followed. Him wherever he went, the rifle resting against the cabin. Wall caught the morning light, his father's old Sharp's .50 caliber, ornately engraved with scrollwork that spoke of better times. Magnus ran his thumb along the stock, feeling the familiar grooves worn smooth by 2 generations of Thorne hands. This rifle had fed his family, protected them, and ultimately failed to save them when it mattered most. 16 years had passed since that winter. 16 years since everything changed. Magnus was 19 then, Clara only 13. Their parents, Thomas and Mary Thorne, had been good people, hard-working homesteaders who believed in God, family, and the promise of the frontier. They had built a decent life in a small valley 20 miles east of here, raising cattle and crops, teaching their children to read and write and respect the land that sustained them. Then came the winter of 1854. A winter so brutal it became legend among the survivors. The snows started in October and didn't stop until May. Temperatures dropped so low that trees exploded in the night, sounding like gunshots. Cattle froze standing up. The isolated homesteads became islands of desperate humanity, cut off from help or hope. Thomas Thorne had been checking the livestock when the blizzard struck without warning. A wall of white that swallowed the world in minutes. Magnus found his father 3 days later, frozen solid 50 feet from the barn door. His mother lasted 2 more weeks, pneumonia taking her slowly, painfully. Magnus held her hand as she died, promising to take care of Clara, to keep her safe no matter what. But he couldn't keep that promise. Not then. The territorial authorities came when the snows finally melted. Social workers from Denver, convinced that a 19-year-old boy couldn't raise a 13-year-old girl in the wilderness. Clara screamed and fought as they loaded her into the wagon, reaching for Magnus with tears streaming down her face. He tried to stop them, but 3 men with badges and legal papers were more than one grieving boy could overcome. "I'll find you," he had shouted as the wagon rolled away. "I'll come for you, Clara, I promise." But the years passed and the promises became harder to keep. Letters went unanswered. Inquiries led to dead ends. The family that took Clara moved east, then disappeared into the vast anonymity of a growing nation. Magnus was left with nothing but memories and the weight of a broken promise. He learned to live with solitude. The mountains became his family, the wilderness his closest companion. He trapped and hunted, trading his furs in Cedar Ridge for supplies and little else. The townspeople viewed him with a mixture of fear and fascination, this giant of a man who lived like a hermit, who spoke only when necessary, who could track a wounded elk through a snowstorm or read weather patterns in cloud formations. Sheriff Dutch Hansen was one of the few who treated Magnus with basic human decency. A practical man in his 50s, Dutch understood that the frontier needed men like Magnus Thorne, hard, capable, and utterly reliable in a crisis. When wolves threatened the town's livestock, Magnus dealt with them. When a child went missing in the woods, Magnus found her. When blizzards trapped travelers in the high country, Magnus brought them home alive. But even Dutch couldn't change how the rest of Cedar Ridge saw the mountain man. To them, Magnus was a curiosity at best, a danger at worst. Preacher Morrison called him a godless savage. The shopkeepers served him quickly and counted their change twice. The women crossed the street rather than walk past him on the wooden sidewalks. Magnus told himself he didn't care. He had chosen this life, embraced the isolation, made peace with being alone. His cabin was comfortable. His skills kept him fed and clothed, and the mountains never disappointed or betrayed him. What more did a man need? Then Clara came back. Magnus was splitting wood behind his cabin when he heard the horse approaching. Visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy, and something about the rhythm of hoofbeats on the mountain trail made him set down his axe and reach for the sharps. In this country, caution kept you alive. The rider that emerged from the tree line was small, wrapped in a heavy coat against the autumn chill. But something about the way she sat the horse, the tilt of her head, the careful way she guided her mount up the rocky path. Magnus felt his heart stop and restart in a different rhythm. Magnus. The voice carried across the clearing like a prayer answered after years of silence. She pulled back her hood, revealing auburn hair that caught the afternoon light, green eyes that he had seen in his dreams for 15 years. A face that had haunted every quiet moment since she disappeared. Clara. The word came out as barely a whisper. She slid down from the saddle, her legs unsteady after the long ride. Magnus was moving before conscious thought took over, crossing the clearing in long strides, catching her as she stumbled. For a moment, they simply held each other, two people who had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, finally reunited by whatever force governs second chances. Clara had grown into a woman of 28, but Magnus could still see the 13-year-old girl who had reached for him from that wagon. Her face was thinner now, marked by experiences he couldn't imagine. But her eyes held the same fierce intelligence, the same stubborn determination that had always defined her. "You kept your promise," she whispered against his chest. "What promise?" "You said you'd always be here waiting. You said these mountains would always be home." Magnus held her tighter, afraid that if he let go, she might disappear again like smoke on the wind. "How did you find me?" "Sheriff Hansen. I rode into town this morning, asked about you. He gave me directions and told me—" She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his bearded face. "He told me you never married. Never left. Just waited up here all these years. There was nowhere else to go." Magnus studied her face, noting the faint lines around her eyes, a small scar on her chin that hadn't been there before. "What happened to you, Clara? Where have you been?" Her expression darkened, and she stepped away from his embrace. "That's a long story. One I'm not sure I'm ready to tell. You don't have to tell me anything. You're here now. That's enough." But even as he said it, Magnus could see the shadows in her eyes, the way her shoulders carried invisible weight. Whatever had brought Clara back to these mountains, it wasn't just sisterly affection or nostalgia for their childhood home. She was running from something or someone. "I was hoping—" Clara looked toward his cabin, then back at his face. "I was hoping I could stay for a while, just until I figure out what comes next. This is your home," Magnus said without hesitation. "For as long as you want it to be." Relief flooded her features, and for a moment she looked like the little girl he remembered. "Thank you." As they walked toward the cabin together, Magnus felt something shift inside his chest, a long, frozen part of his heart beginning to thaw. For 15 years, he had convinced himself that solitude was enough, that he needed nothing beyond the mountains and his own resources. But having Clara beside him again, hearing her voice mix with the mountain wind, he realized how empty his life had become. The cabin felt different with her in it. Warmer somehow, more alive. Clara moved through the single room with the easy familiarity of childhood memories, touching things that had belonged to their parents, pausing at the window that looked out toward the valley where they had grown up. "Do you ever go back there?" she asked, nodding toward the distant peaks. "Once," Magnus admitted. "About 5 years ago. The house was gone. Nothing left but the foundation stones and some fence posts." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the dusty windowsill. "Sometimes I dream about that place, about all of us together before everything went wrong." "Me too." She turned to face him, and Magnus saw something vulnerable in her expression, a need for comfort that ran deeper than words could express. Without thinking, he opened his arms, and she came to him like she had when she was 13 and thunderstorms had frightened her awake. But she wasn't 13 anymore, and the woman in his arms stirred feelings that had nothing to do with brotherly protection. Magnus pushed those thoughts away, focusing instead on the simple miracle of having her back. Whatever complications her return might bring, whatever secrets she carried, nothing mattered more than this moment of reunion. Outside, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and purple. Soon, the first stars would appear, and the mountain silence would settle over the valley like a familiar blanket. Magnus and Clara would sit by the fire, sharing stories and memories, slowly bridging the gap of 15 lost years. Neither of them knew that their reunion had already been noticed. That down in Cedar Ridge, curious eyes had watched Clara's arrival and departure from town. That tongues were already beginning to wag about the mountain man's mysterious female visitor. The bonds that had once kept them alive as children were about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. But for now, in the gathering dusk of a Colorado evening, brother and sister were finally home. 3 days after Clara's return, Magnus discovered the truth about why she had come back to the mountains. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, moving quietly through the cabin to avoid disturbing her sleep. Clara had taken his bed, while he made do with blankets on the floor, an arrangement that felt both natural and strangely charged with unspoken tension. She slept restlessly, often crying out in her dreams, words he couldn't quite make out, but that carried the weight of old pain. Magnus was stoking the fire when he heard her stirring, followed by the soft sound of weeping. He turned to find Clara sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "Clara," he crossed to her side, uncertain whether to touch her or give her space. "What's wrong?" She looked up at him with eyes red from crying and slowly extended her left hand. There, on her ring finger, was a simple gold band that caught the firelight. A wedding ring he hadn't noticed before. "I'm married," she whispered, as if the words themselves were poison. Magnus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Married. His name is Edmund Blackwood, a lawyer in Boston. Wealthy, respected, everything a woman is supposed to want. Her voice carried bitter irony. "My adoptive family arranged it when I turned 20. They said I was lucky to catch such a prominent man's attention." The silence stretched between them, filled with implications Magnus didn't want to consider. "Clara, if you're married—" "He hits me." The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "Started on our wedding night, said I was too willful, too independent, that he would teach me proper wifely submission." Magnus's hands clenched into fists, and he felt the familiar rage that had sustained him through years of solitude. But this was different. This was personal, protective, the fury of a man whose family had been threatened. Did he hurt you badly?" Clara pulled back the sleeve of her nightgown, revealing faded bruises on her wrist in the unmistakable pattern of finger marks. "This was from 2 weeks ago, when I tried to leave the first time. He caught me at the train station." "Jesus Christ." Magnus reached out gently, his massive hands making her delicate wrist look even more fragile. "Clara, Why didn't you leave him sooner? Where was I supposed to go? I had no money of my own, no family except," she gestured toward him. "I wasn't even sure you were still alive. The adoption family never spoke of you after they took me away. For all I knew, you had died in some mountain accident years ago." Magnus sat beside her on the bed, the mattress creaking under his weight. "What changed? What made you finally run?" Clara was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He started talking about children, about how a son would steady me, give me proper purpose. He said," her voice broke, "he said if I didn't conceive soon, he would find ways to encourage the process." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dirty fire. Magnus felt murderous rage building in his chest, the kind of cold fury that had made him so effective at dealing with wolves and other predators. Edmund Blackwood was just another predator, albeit one that wore fine clothes and spoke with cultured words. "So you ran." "I stole money from his desk drawer and left in the middle of the night. Took the first train west and never looked back." Clara touched the wedding ring with her other hand, as if it were a shackle she couldn't remove. "But he'll come looking for me. Men like Edmund don't let their property simply walk away." "Property?" The word came out as a growl. "That's how he sees me. How the law sees me. A wife belongs to her husband, just like his horse or his house. If he finds me," she shivered despite the warmth of the fire, "he'll drag me back to Boston. And next time I won't have the chance to run." Magnus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaks that had been his refuge for so many years. The mountains had always offered him sanctuary, but this was different. This wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. This was about protecting Clara from a threat that came with legal authority and social respectability. "He won't find you here," Magnus said finally. "This country is hard on men who aren't used to it. City lawyers don't last long in the Rockies. You don't understand." Clara joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Edmund has resources. He can hire bounty hunters, private detectives. He can offer rewards that would tempt even honest men. Let him try." Magnus's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had survived everything the wilderness could throw at him. "These mountains have kept me safe for 16 years. They'll keep you safe too." But even as he spoke the words, Magnus felt the weight of new responsibility settling on his shoulders. Hiding from society was one thing. He had chosen that isolation, embraced it. Protecting Clara from a determined and wealthy husband was something else entirely. It would mean contact with the outside world, dealing with legal authorities, possibly violence. "There's something else," Clara said quietly. "Something you need to know before this goes any further." She walked to her saddlebags, which Magnus had left untouched in the corner of the cabin. From inside, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. When she unfolded it, Magnus saw papers, legal documents, letters, and something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a photograph, cracked and faded with age, showing two couples standing in front of a simple wooden house. Magnus recognized his parents immediately, Thomas and Mary Thorne, young and hopeful in their wedding clothes. But the other couple was unfamiliar, a dark-haired man and a blonde woman who looked nothing like Clara. "That's my real parents," Clara said, watching his face carefully. "John and Sarah Mitchell. They died in a cholera outbreak when I was 3 years old." Magnus stared at the photograph, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "But you're my sister." "No, Magnus, I'm not." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "Your parents took me in after mine died. They raised me as their own daughter, loved me like their own child, but we're not blood relatives." The cabin seemed to tilt around Magnus as the foundations of his world shifted. 16 years of believing. He had failed to protect his sister, 16 years of living with the guilt of separation, 16 years of thinking about Clara as the one person in the world who shared his blood, his history, his loss. "Why didn't they ever tell me?" They planned to when we were older, when we could understand what it meant. Clara sat down heavily on the bed, the photograph clutched in her hands. But they died before they got the chance. I only found out myself 5 years ago when I was going through Edmund's papers. He had investigated my background before agreeing to the marriage, wanted to make sure there were no embarrassing family secrets. Magnus walked to the fireplace, bracing his hands against the stone mantel. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his relationship with Clara, all of it was built on a foundation that had just crumbled away. "Say something," Clara whispered behind him. Magnus turned to face her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since her return, not as the little sister he had failed to protect, but as a woman who had suffered and survived, who had chosen to come back to him despite years of separation and uncertainty. "It doesn't change anything," he said finally. "You're still family, still the most important person in my world." Relief flooded her features, but Magnus could see something else in her eyes: hope, gratitude, and something deeper that he wasn't ready to name or acknowledge. "The townspeople won't understand," Clara said quietly. "When they see us together, living in the same cabin, they'll assume—" "I don't care what they assume." Magnus's voice carried the finality of a man who had made his choice. "Let them talk. Let them think whatever they want. You belong here with me, and that's all that matters." But even as he spoke the words, Magnus knew that Clara was right. The people of Cedar Ridge would see what they wanted to see, assume what they wanted to assume. And those assumptions would bring consequences that neither of them could fully predict. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and green. Soon Magnus would need to check his trap lines, and Clara would settle into the rhythm of mountain life. But first, they would have to face the reality of what her return meant, not just for them, but for the community that watched the mountain. Man's every move with suspicious eyes. The bonds that had once saved them as children were about to become the very thing that might destroy them both. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Ridge. By the second week of Clara's stay at Magnus's cabin, the whispers had begun in earnest. It started innocently enough. Sarah Mitchell, who ran the general store with her husband Tom, mentioned to Pastor Morrison that she had seen a woman riding out toward Thorne's place. Morrison, a man who viewed Magnus with deep suspicion already, shared this information with Sheriff Hanson during their weekly chess game. Hanson, trying to diffuse what he sensed might become problematic gossip, mentioned casually that the visitor was Magnus's sister, returned after many years, but the clarification only made things worse. "Sister?" Morrison had repeated, his thick eyebrows drawing together. "Living up there alone with him? That don't seem proper, Dutch. Not proper at all." Magnus became aware of the town's attention during his weekly supply run. He rode down the mountain trail, as he had every Thursday for the past 10 years, his pack mules loaded with fur pelts and fresh game to trade for coffee, flour, and other necessities. But this time, conversation stopped when he approached. Eyes followed him more intently than usual. The normal rhythm of small-town life seemed disrupted by his presence. At Mitchell's general store, Sarah Mitchell greeted him with unusual warmth. She was a woman in her 40s, plain-faced but kind-hearted, who had always treated Magnus with basic human decency when many others would not. "Magnus," she said, leaning across the counter as he set down his list of supplies, "I heard your sister has come home. That must be wonderful for you after all these years apart." "It is," Magnus replied carefully, sensing undercurrents in the conversation he didn't fully understand. "I remember Clara from when you were children," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a nostalgic quality. "Before the terrible winter that took your parents. She was such a sweet little thing, always following you around like you were her hero." Magnus nodded, accepting the bag of coffee beans she handed him. Around the small medicine pouch he wore at his belt, a gift from an old Ute trapper who had taught him to read sign and weather, he could feel the familiar comfort of traditions that connected him to the land rather than to the complicated social dynamics of town life. She's welcome to come to town anytime, Sarah added. I'd love to meet the woman she's become, but even Sarah's kindness carried an undertone of curiosity that made Magnus uncomfortable. He completed his shopping quickly and loaded his supplies onto the pack mules. Eager to return to the clarity of mountain life, the ride home took him past the church, where Pastor Morrison stood on the front steps talking with several other men from town. Their conversation halted abruptly when Magnus appeared, and Morrison raised his hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning. "Thorne!" the preacher called out. "Might I have a word?" Magnus reined in his horse, already knowing he wouldn't like whatever Morrison had to say. The preacher was a thin man in his 60s, with wild grey hair and the fevered eyes of someone who saw sin lurking in every shadow. He had never approved of Magnus's solitary lifestyle, viewing it as evidence of moral corruption. "I understand you have family visiting," Morrison said, walking closer to Magnus's horse. "Your sister returned from back east." "That's right, and she's staying at your cabin, alone with you, unmarried as you are." Magnus felt heat rising in his chest, but kept his voice level. "Clara is my sister, preacher. She's family. Family or not, it creates an appearance of impropriety that troubles the righteous minds of this community." Morrison's voice carried the theatrical quality he used from his pulpit. A man and woman, living together without the sanctification of marriage. Isolated from proper Christian supervision, surely you can understand how this might seem to godly people. "What it seems like is none of my concern," Magnus replied. "Or yours?" Morrison's eyes flashed with indignation. "Everything that happens in this valley is my concern when it involves moral corruption. I have a duty to protect this community from influences that might..." "Preacher!" Sheriff Hanson's voice cut across the conversation as he approached from the direction of his office. "Magnus, everything all right here?" Dutch Hanson was a practical man who had learned to navigate the complex social currents of frontier life. He nodded to Magnus with the respect due to a man who had proved his worth in difficult circumstances, then turned to Morrison with barely concealed irritation. "We were just discussing the situation up at Thorne's place," Morrison said, his tone suggesting great import. "The impropriety of the living arrangement." "Impropriety." Dutch's voice was flat. "Magnus, your sister staying with you is improper how exactly?" "An unmarried man and woman living together without supervision. They're brother and sister, preacher. Raised in the same house, separated by circumstances beyond their control. Seems natural they'd want to reconnect after all these years." Dutch's gaze moved between the two men. "I don't see any law being broken, any harm being done." But Morrison was not easily deterred. "The appearance of sin can be as damaging as sin itself, Sheriff. What kind of example does this set for the young people of our community? What happens is people mind their own business," Magnus interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. "Clara is my family. She's welcome in my home for as long as she wants to stay. That's all there is to it." He spurred his horse forward, ending the conversation by the simple expedient of riding away. But he could feel Morrison's disapproving stare following him as he left town. And he knew the preacher's concerns would not end with this confrontation. The ride back up the mountain gave Magnus time to think about what had just happened. He had lived as an outsider for so long that he had forgotten how quickly small communities could turn suspicious when their established patterns were disrupted. His relationship with Cedar Ridge had always been tenuous, based on mutual necessity rather than acceptance. Now Clara's presence threatened to upset that delicate balance. When he reached the cabin, he found Clara sitting by the creek that ran behind their home, her feet dangling in the cold water. She had changed from her traveling clothes into one of his old shirts and a pair of work pants she had altered to fit her smaller frame. Her hair was tied back simply, and her face had gained some color from the mountain sun. She looked, Magnus realized, like she belonged here. "How did your trip to town go?" she asked, looking up as he approached. Magnus sat beside her on the creek bank, considering how much to tell her about Morrison's concerns. "Fine, got the supplies we needed, but Clara had always been able to read his moods, even as a child. What really happened, Magnus? He sighed, picking up a smooth stone and turning it over in his hands. Some people are concerned about our living arrangement. Think it looks improper. Because we're not married. Because we're not married and living together. Magnus threw the stone into the creek, watching the ripples spread outward. The preacher seems particularly troubled by it. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her toes making small splashes in the water. I could leave, she said finally. Find somewhere else to go. No. The word came out more forcefully than Magnus had intended. This is your home now. These mountains are your home. I won't let small-minded gossip drive you away. But if it makes trouble for you, I've been dealing with trouble from that town for 16 years. This isn't different. Magnus reached over and took her hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. We'll face whatever comes together. The way we should have all those years ago. Clara squeezed his hand in return, and something passed between them in that moment. An understanding that went deeper than words. They were family in all the ways that mattered, and neither gossip nor legal technicalities could change that fundamental truth. But as the sun set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, both of them knew that the challenges ahead would test that bond in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Clara's journal became her sanctuary during those first weeks in the mountains. She wrote by candlelight after Magnus fell asleep, pouring her thoughts onto pages that no one else would ever see. The journal itself was small, leather-bound, something she had purchased secretly during her marriage to Edmund, one of the few possessions that was truly her own. October 15th, 1870. Magnus doesn't know about the sickness in the mornings. I've been careful to wake before him, to step outside and be ill where he can't hear. But I can't hide this much longer. My body is changing in ways that frighten and confuse me. Is it possible? Could I be carrying Edmund's child after just 3 months of marriage? The thought makes me sick in ways that have nothing to do with morning nausea. A child would tie me to him forever, give him legal grounds to reclaim me no matter where I run. But there's another possibility, one I hardly dare write down, even here. These feelings I have for Magnus, the way my heart races when he looks at me, the comfort I find in his arms when nightmares wake me. This isn't how sisters feel about their brothers. And we're not truly siblings, are we? The photograph proves that even if 25 years of believing otherwise makes it hard to accept, what if this child isn't Edmund's at all? What if it belongs to the man I've always loved, even when I thought that love was forbidden? Clara set down her pen and pressed her hands to her still, flat stomach. The timing was impossible to determine with certainty. Her cycle had never been regular, made worse by the stress of her marriage and escape. The nausea could be from many causes: travel, anxiety, the change in diet and altitude. But deep in her heart she knew the truth. She was pregnant. The knowledge terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. A child would complicate everything, make her more vulnerable to Edmund's pursuit, harder to hide or protect. But it would also be something wonderful, a life created from love rather than duty, raised in freedom rather than fear. The sound of Magnus stirring in his sleep made her quickly close the journal and blow out the candle. She lay back on the narrow bed they had been sharing. Another arrangement that would scandalize the townspeople. If they knew and listened to his quiet breathing in the darkness, they had fallen into domestic patterns with surprising ease. Magnus would wake before dawn to check his trap lines or hunt for fresh meat. Clara would tend the cabin, wash their clothes in the creek, prepare meals from whatever he brought home. They would spend their evenings by the fire, talking about childhood memories or reading aloud from the few books Magnus owned. It felt like playing house, like the games they had enjoyed as children. But there was an undercurrent of tension that grew stronger each day, moments when their hands would brush and linger, when Magnus would look at her with an expression that had nothing to do with brotherly affection, when Clara would catch herself imagining what it would be like to truly be his wife rather than just his housekeeper. The next morning brought visitors. Clara was hanging wash on the line behind the cabin when she heard horses approaching. Magnus emerged from the barn where he had been repairing a saddle, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept nearby. But his posture relaxed when he recognized the riders, Sheriff Hanson and another man Clara didn't recognize. "Morning, Magnus," Dutch called out as he dismounted. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. Got some folks here I'd like you to meet." The second man was well-dressed, with the soft look of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the saddle. He introduced himself as James Crawford, territorial representative from Denver, and his presence immediately put Clara on edge. "Mr. Crawford is traveling through, meeting with residents, getting a sense of how territorial governance is working in the remote areas," Dutch explained. But Clara could see something in the sheriff's eyes, a warning perhaps, or an apology for bringing unwelcome scrutiny to their door. "And you are?" Crawford addressed Clara with the practiced courtesy of a politician. "Clara Thorne," Magnus answered before she could speak. "My sister." Crawford studied them both with sharp eyes. "Sister, I see. You live here together?" "Clara recently returned after many years back east," Magnus said carefully. "She's staying with me while she decides what comes next." "Ah," Crawford nodded, as if this explained everything. "And your husband, Mrs. It is Mrs., isn't it?" The ring suggests. Clara's hand went instinctively to the wedding band she still wore, a constant reminder of the life she had escaped. "My husband is deceased," she said quickly, the lie coming easier than the truth. Magnus shot her a sharp look, but said nothing. Dutch shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "My condolences," Crawford said smoothly. "The frontier can be hard on families. I'm sure your brother's protection is a great comfort during your time of grief." They talked for another few minutes about territorial business, mining claims, and the general state of affairs in the Colorado Territory. But Clara could feel Crawford's attention returning to her repeatedly, his gaze taking in details she wished he wouldn't notice. After the men left, Magnus confronted her about the lie. "Why did you tell him your husband was dead?" Clara walked back to the clothesline, keeping her hands busy to avoid meeting his eyes. "Because the truth is more complicated than a territorial representative needs to know." "Clara," Magnus's voice was gentle but insistent. "We can't build our life here on lies. This is a small territory. Word travels, records get checked. If Edmund comes looking for me, I'll deal with it then." Clara yanked a shirt from the line with more force than necessary. "Until then, I'm a widow seeking comfort with her only living relative. That's a story people can understand and accept." Magnus was quiet for a long moment. "Is there anything else I should know? Any other complications you haven't told me about?" Clara felt the weight of her secret pressing against her ribs like a physical thing. The morning sickness, the exhaustion, the changes in her body that were becoming harder to hide, all of it would have to come out eventually. But not today. Not when they were just beginning to find their equilibrium. "No," she said softly. "Nothing else." But as she spoke the lie, Clara felt the first flutter of movement in her womb, so slight she might have imagined it, but unmistakable to a woman who had been waiting for exactly that sign. The child was real, growing, demanding acknowledgement whether she was ready or not. That night, she wrote in her journal again, "October 20th, 1870, the baby moved today." Just a whisper of sensation, like a butterfly trapped behind my ribs, but enough to make everything real in a way it wasn't before. "I'm going to have a child, and that child is going to change everything." Magnus deserves to know the truth. He deserves to understand what my presence here might cost him. But I'm terrified that if I tell him, he'll see it as his duty to send me away for my own protection. And I can't leave, not now. This place, these mountains, Magnus himself, they're the only home I've ever truly had. I need more time. Time to figure out what I'm going to do. Time to prepare Magnus for the reality of what's coming. Time to build the strength I'll need for whatever battles lie ahead. But time is the one thing I may not have. My body won't keep this secret much longer, and when the truth comes out, it will change everything between us. I just pray it doesn't destroy the happiness we've managed to find. The town meeting was called for a Tuesday evening in late October. ostensibly to discuss preparations for winter and the allocation of resources for families in need. But everyone who attended knew the real purpose: to address the situation at Magnus Thorne's cabin. Pastor Morrison had been building toward this moment for weeks, his Sunday sermons growing increasingly pointed about moral corruption and the dangers of tolerating sin within the community. The wooden cross that hung behind his pulpit seemed to loom larger during these speeches, casting stern shadows over the congregation as he spoke about the need for righteous action. We cannot simply ignore what is happening in our midst, Morrison declared to the gathering of 30-odd residents in the church hall. A man and woman, living together without the sanctification of marriage, flaunting their improper arrangement for all to see. What message does this send to our children? What example are we setting for future generations? Sheriff Dutch Hansen shifted uncomfortably in his seat near the back of the room. He had hoped to avoid this confrontation, but Morrison's campaign had gained too much momentum to stop quietly. "Now hold on, preacher," said Tom Mitchell, Sarah's husband, and one of the more level-headed voices in town. "Magnus Thorne has never caused trouble for anyone here. He minds his own business, helps out when folks need it. What he does on his own property isn't our concern. Morrison's voice rose to the theatrical pitch he used during his most fervent sermons. When sin flourishes unchecked, it corrupts the entire community. We have a moral obligation, a Christian duty, to address this matter. Sarah Mitchell stood up from her seat in the middle of the room. "Preacher Morrison, with all due respect, Magnus and Clara are brother and sister. They were raised together as children, separated by tragedy, and now reunited. I fail to see how family caring for family constitutes sin. Brother and sister living alone together without proper supervision or marriage." Morrison's eyes gleamed with righteous fervor. "The appearance of impropriety is often as damaging as impropriety itself. And appearances, Mrs. Mitchell, can be very deceiving." Doc Henderson, an elderly physician who had seen enough of life to maintain healthy skepticism about most things, spoke from his corner seat. "What exactly are you proposing, preacher? That we ride up to Magnus's place and demand he explain his living arrangements? That we pass judgment on decisions that harm no one? I propose we do our Christian duty," Morrison replied. "We send a delegation to speak with this woman, to understand her intentions, to ensure that proper moral standards are being maintained. And if they are not?" The question came from Jake Stevens, a young hothead who worked at the livery stable and had always resented Magnus's standoffish attitude. "What then?" The room grew quiet, tension building like pressure before a storm. Dutch Hansen finally stood, his authority as sheriff lending weight to his words. "Let's all take a step back here," he said calmly. "Magnus Thorne is a citizen of this territory with the same rights as any of us. He's broken no laws, caused no trouble, harmed no one. Whatever concerns people might have about his personal life don't constitute grounds for official intervention. The law isn't the only authority we answer to, Sheriff," Morrison countered. "There are higher laws, moral laws, that supersede earthly statutes." "Maybe so, preacher, but I enforce earthly statutes, and that's the authority I recognize." Dutch's tone carried quiet steel. "Anyone thinking of taking matters into their own hands better think again." But Morrison was not deterred. "Then we'll approach this through proper channels. A concerned visit from community leaders, offering guidance and support to help resolve this unfortunate situation." "Define resolve," Sarah Mitchell said sharply. "Marriage," Morrison replied without hesitation. "If this woman wishes to remain in our community, she should find a proper husband, someone who can provide legitimate protection and moral guidance. There are several respectable widowers who might be suitable." The suggestion hit the room like a physical blow. Several people shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the implications. They were talking about forcing Clara into an unwanted marriage, treating her like property to be disposed of according to community standards. "That's enough." Dutch's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "We're not arranging marriages for grown women or dictating how people live their lives. This meeting is over. But as people began to file out of the church hall, clusters of conversation formed, plans began to coalesce, and the divided nature of Cedar Ridge's opinion became clear. About half the community supported Morrison's position, viewing Magnus and Clara's situation as scandalous and requiring intervention. The other half saw it as none of their business, or even admirable. Family taking care of family in a harsh land where such bonds often meant survival. Sarah Mitchell lingered after most others had left. Approaching Dutch near the door. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Morrison has been working on this for weeks. He's convinced some of the more influential families that action needs to be taken." "What kind of action?" "I'm not sure yet, but Jake Stevens and some of the younger men seem eager to prove their moral righteousness. And Morrison has been corresponding with territorial authorities about concerns regarding moral standards in remote communities." Dutch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. "You think he'd try to bring in outside pressure?" "I think Morrison sees this as his chance to establish moral authority over the whole community. Magnus and Clara are just the excuse he's been waiting for." Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Someone should warn them." "I'll ride up there tomorrow," Dutch promised. "But Sarah, keep your ears open. If you hear about any specific plans, anything that sounds like it might turn ugly, you let me know immediately." The next morning brought the first hard frost of autumn, painting the valley in shades of silver and white. Magnus was splitting wood when Dutch arrived, the steady rhythm of his axe echoing off the surrounding peaks. "Sheriff," Magnus nodded as Dutch dismounted. "What brings you up the mountain?" "Trouble, I'm afraid." Dutch accepted the cup of coffee Clara offered, noting how healthy she looked despite the stress they must be under. "There was a town meeting last night." "About you two." Clara and Magnus exchanged glances, and Dutch saw something pass between them. Understanding, perhaps, or resignation, that they had been expecting this moment. "What kind of trouble?" Magnus asked, setting down his axe. Dutch explained the meeting, Morrison's position, the divided community opinion, and the vague threats of intervention. As he spoke, he watched Clara's face grow pale, saw her hands tremble slightly as she held her coffee cup. "What do you recommend?" Magnus asked when Dutch finished. "Honestly, I think you should consider making this official. Get married, remove any ammunition Morrison might have for his moral crusade." "We're brother and sister," Clara said quietly. "Are you?" Dutch studied both their faces. "I mean, I know you were raised as siblings, but folks are starting to ask questions about that too. About exactly what your relationship is, where you came from, whether—" He stopped, seeing the warning in Magnus's expression. "Whether what, Dutch?" "Whether the bond between you goes deeper than family affection." Dutch set down his coffee cup. "Look, I'm not judging anyone here, but appearances matter in small communities, and right now, appearances are working against you." Magnus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Dutch to Clara and back again. "We'll handle this our own way." "I hope so," Dutch said, standing to leave. "Because Morrison isn't going to let this drop. And some of the men in town are starting to talk about taking action themselves if official channels don't produce results." After Dutch left, Magnus and Clara sat in silence on their cabin porch, watching the morning mist rise from the valley below. The peaceful scene felt fragile now, threatened by forces beyond their control. "Maybe I should leave," Clara said finally. "No." Magnus's response was immediate and final. "This is your home, our home. I won't let them drive you away." But even as he spoke the words, both of them knew that the battle for their right to live as they chose was just beginning. The letter arrived on a grey November morning, carried by a territorial courier who looked uncomfortable with his mission. Magnus found it nailed to his cabin door, an official-looking envelope with expensive paper and precise handwriting that made his stomach clench with foreboding. Clara was inside preparing breakfast when he brought the letter in, but one look at his face told her everything she needed to know. Her coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor. "It's from him, isn't it?" she whispered. Magnus broke the wax seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The letterhead read, Blackwood and Associates, Legal Counsel, Boston, Massachusetts. But it was the content that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Clara Blackwood, he read aloud, his voice flat and emotionless. You are hereby notified that your unlawful departure from your lawful husband's home constitutes abandonment of your marital duties and theft of marital property. You are commanded to return immediately to Boston, Massachusetts, where you will resume your proper place as wife and helpmate. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in legal action to compel your return, including but not limited to criminal charges of theft and adultery. Clara sank into a chair, her face white as winter snow. Adultery? Magnus continued reading. Furthermore, reports have reached this office regarding your current living arrangements with one Magnus Thorne, described as a brother, but suspected of being an illicit paramour. Such conduct, if proven, will result in additional legal consequences and public scandal that will follow you regardless of where you might attempt to hide. The letter was signed with Edmund Blackwood's elaborate signature, but it carried an additional notation: investigation and enforcement services provided by Pinkerton Detective Agency. Pinkertons, Magnus said grimly. He's hired professional manhunters. Clara stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains that no longer seemed like adequate protection. They're already here, aren't they? Watching us? Gathering evidence. Magnus joined her at the window, scanning the tree line for signs of surveillance. Maybe? Probably. He set the letter on the table, its presence seeming to poison the air in their small cabin. Clara, there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything about how we handle this. She turned to face him, and Magnus saw knowledge in her eyes, the same knowledge he had been trying to ignore for weeks. You're pregnant, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Magnus had grown up on a farm, had spent years in the wilderness observing animal behavior. He recognized the signs, the morning sickness Clara tried to hide, the way her body was changing, the exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Clara nodded slowly, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. 3 months, maybe 4. I wasn't sure at first, but is it mine? The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a green fire, acrid and inescapable. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face for something. Judgment, perhaps, or condemnation. I don't know, she admitted finally. The timing, it could be Edmund's, from our wedding night or the few times after when he... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. But it could be yours too. From that night when the thunderstorm scared me awake. When you held me and I felt safe for the first time in years. When we forgot we were supposed to be brother and sister, Magnus finished gently. Yes, Clara's voice was barely a whisper. I tried to tell myself it was grief, loneliness, the stress of everything that had happened. But that would be another lie, wouldn't it? The truth is, I've loved you my whole life. Even when I thought that love was wrong, even when I tried to marry Edmund and be the proper wife everyone expected me to be. Magnus reached out and took her hands in his, feeling how small and fragile they were compared to his own calloused palms. Clara, listen to me. That night, I've regretted it and treasured it every day since. Regretted it because I thought I was taking advantage of your vulnerability, treasuring it because it was the most honest moment of my life. Do you regret learning we're not truly siblings? The question was asked so quietly, Magnus almost didn't hear it. When he looked into her eyes, he saw hope and fear warring in equal measure. Hope that his answer would free them both, fear that it would confirm her worst suspicions about herself. No, he said firmly. I thank God every day that we're not blood relatives, because it means what I feel for you isn't the sin I thought it was. It means when I hold you at night, when I watch you moving around our cabin like you were born to be here, when I imagine a future with you as my wife instead of my ward, it means those feelings are natural and right. Clara began to cry in earnest then, relief and gratitude pouring out in a way that spoke of months of suppressed emotion. Magnus pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest while she sobbed. But the baby, she said when she could speak again. If it's Edmund's, It doesn't matter whose blood the child carries, Magnus said firmly. What matters is who raises it, who loves it, who teaches it right from wrong. If you'll have me as your husband, I'll be a father to that child, regardless of who contributed to its making. Clara pulled back to look at him, her face streaked with tears, but glowing with something that might have been joy. You'd do that? Claim another man's child as your own? I'd do anything for you, Clara. Haven't you figured that out yet? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment. Magnus moved to the window, peering through the curtains at 3 riders approaching the cabin. One he recognized as Sheriff Dutch Hansen. The other 2 were strangers, well-dressed men with the hard look of professionals. Pinkertons, Magnus said grimly. Clara joined him at the window, her face paling again. They found us faster than I expected. Probably had help from someone in town. Magnus reached for his father's rifle, checking to ensure it was loaded. Someone who's been watching us, reporting our movements. The riders reined in before the cabin, and Dutch dismounted with obvious reluctance. One of the strangers remained mounted, while the other joined Dutch on the ground. A lean man with pale eyes and a mustache that failed to soften his harsh features. "Magnus!" Dutch called out. "Need to have a word with you and Clara. These gentlemen are here on official business." Magnus opened the door, but remained in the threshold, his rifle held casually but ready. "What kind of official business?" The Pinkerton detective stepped forward, producing a leather wallet that contained his credentials. "Detective William Hayes, Pinkerton Agency. I'm here regarding Clara Blackwood, wanted for theft and abandonment of marital duties. We have a legal warrant for her return to Boston. Mrs. Blackwood is under the protection of her family," Magnus replied evenly. "She's committed no crimes in this territory. The warrant is valid throughout the United States," Hayes responded. "And there are additional charges pending if the adultery allegations prove founded." His pale eyes fixed on Clara, who had appeared beside Magnus in the doorway. "Ma'am, you can make this easy on everyone by coming with us voluntarily." "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said, her voice stronger than Magnus had expected. Hayes smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "That's unfortunate. Because one way or another you're coming back to Boston. Your husband has been very patient, but his patience has limits. So does mine," Magnus said quietly, shifting the rifle slightly. The tension in the clearing was palpable. 4 men and 1 woman balanced on the edge of violence. Dutch Hansen looked deeply uncomfortable with his position, caught between his duty as sheriff and his basic human decency. "There's got to be a way to work this out," Dutch said finally. "Some legal process." "The legal process is simple," Hayes interrupted. "Mrs. Blackwood returns with us to face her husband and the charges against her. Everything else is just delay tactics." But as he spoke, Hayes's attention was caught by something that made his cold smile widen. His gaze had fixed on Clara's midsection, where her condition was becoming impossible to hide, despite the loose clothing she favored. "Well, well," Hayes murmured. "This does complicate things, doesn't it? Mr. Blackwood will be very interested to learn about your condition, ma'am. Very interested indeed." The birth certificate was hidden in Clara's saddlebags, wrapped in oilcloth beneath her few changes of clothing. Magnus had never thought to search her belongings. Privacy was a sacred thing in their relationship, born from years of having so little of it. But as Detective Hayes's implications hung in the air like smoke from a dirty fire, Clara knew the time for secrets had ended. "Wait," she said, stepping back into the cabin. "There's something you all need to see before this goes any further." Hayes's hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Ma'am, I'd advise you not to make any sudden movements." "She's getting papers," Magnus said calmly, though his own rifle remained ready. "Legal documents that might change your understanding of the situation." Clara returned moments later with a folded document that looked official enough to command attention. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, revealing the ornate script and formal seals of legal bureaucracy. "This is my birth certificate," she announced, her voice carrying across the clearing. "My real birth certificate, not the amended version that was filed after my adoption. Sheriff Hansen stepped closer, his years of dealing with legal documents making him the natural authority. "What does it say, Clara?" "It says my name is Clara Elizabeth Mitchell, daughter of John and Sarah Mitchell, born October 15th, 1842, in Jefferson County, Colorado Territory." Clara's voice grew stronger as she read. "It says nothing about the Thorne family because I was never legally adopted by them. I was simply taken in after my parents died in a cholera epidemic." The words fell into the clearing like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication in every direction. Hayes frowned, clearly trying to process this new information and its impact on his mission. Dutch Hansen's expression shifted from confusion to dawning understanding. "You're not siblings," Dutch said slowly. "No," Clara confirmed. "Magnus and I are not related by blood or law. We were raised together after my parents died because Thomas and Mary Thorne were good people who couldn't bear to see a child suffer. But we are not and have never been brother and sister." Magnus felt the world shift around him, despite having suspected this truth for months. Hearing it spoken aloud, supported by legal documentation, made it real in a way that changed everything. Hayes studied the document, his detective's training evident in the thorough way he examined the seals and signatures. "This appears genuine," he admitted reluctantly. "But it doesn't change the fundamental legal reality. You're still married to Edmund Blackwood, still subject to the warrant for your return." "Actually," said a new voice from the tree line, "it changes everything." Everyone spun toward the sound, weapons raised as a fourth rider emerged from the forest. But this newcomer was unexpected. An elderly man in a black suit, riding a tired-looking mare and carrying a leather satchel that marked him as some kind of professional. "Judge Harrison." Dutch Hansen lowered his gun, recognition clear in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Judge Marcus Harrison was the territorial circuit judge, a man whose jurisdiction covered thousands of square miles of frontier territory. He was known for his fair but firm interpretation of law, his willingness to travel to remote areas to ensure justice was served, and his complete intolerance for legal technicalities that served injustice rather than truth. "I received some interesting correspondence from Boston," Harrison said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose bones ached from too many years in the saddle. "Letters from a Mr. Edmund Blackwood, making rather serious allegations about moral corruption and legal violations in my territory." Hayes stepped forward, clearly sensing an ally. "Your Honor, I represent Mr. Blackwood's interests in this matter." "We have warrants." "Yes, I'm sure you do." Harrison's tone was dry as desert sand. "But before we discuss warrants, I think we should discuss the validity of the marriage that supposedly gives Mr. Blackwood authority over this woman." Clara felt her heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that seemed to echo in her ears. "The validity of my marriage?" Harrison opened his leather satchel and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "Upon receiving Mr. Blackwood's complaints, I took the liberty of investigating the circumstances of your union. What I found was quite illuminating." He spread several papers on a flat boulder that served as an impromptu table. "Marriage license, dated June 15th, 1870, signed by Clara Mitchell," note the surname, "and Edmund Blackwood. Witnessed by—" Harrison paused, his finger tracing the signatures. "This is interesting. The witnesses are listed as Thomas and Margaret Sullivan, supposedly Clara's adoptive guardians." "That's correct," Clara said quietly. "The family that took me in after the Thornes died." "Except," Harrison continued, "Thomas and Margaret Sullivan died of typhoid fever in April of 1870, 2 months before this marriage allegedly took place. Their deaths are documented in Chicago municipal records." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind in the pine trees. Hayes looked like a man who had just watched his case collapse before his eyes. Clara stared at the judge in amazement, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "the minister who allegedly performed the ceremony, one Reverend David Morrison, was defrocked by the Episcopal Church in 1869 for financial irregularities. He had no legal authority to perform marriages at the time this ceremony supposedly took place. Magnus found his voice first. "What are you saying, Judge?" "I'm saying that Clara Mitchell was never legally married to Edmund Blackwood. The entire ceremony was a sham, performed by a defrocked minister with forged witness signatures." Harrison's eyes fixed on Hayes. "Which means your warrants are based on a fraudulent marriage contract, and your entire mission here is without legal foundation." Hayes's face had gone pale, but his training kept him focused. "Even if the marriage is invalid, there are still charges of theft." "Of what?" Harrison interrupted. "A wife's legal right to her husband's property depends on the validity of the marriage. No marriage, no legal claim. And since the marriage was fraudulent from the beginning, any property Clara may have taken was simply recovery of her own belongings." Clara sank onto a tree stump, overwhelmed by the implications. "But I lived with him for months. I thought I was married." "You were the victim of an elaborate fraud," Harrison said gently. "Mr. Blackwood conspired to trap you in what you believed was a legal marriage, then used that false authority to control and abuse you. In the eyes of the law, you were never his wife." Magnus stepped closer to Clara, his protective instincts overwhelming his caution. "What happens now?" Harrison began folding his documents back into their proper order. "Now Miss Mitchell is free to make her own choices about her life and future. Mr. Blackwood has no legal claim over her, and Detective Hayes has no grounds for compelling her return to Boston." Hayes looked like a man who had just lost a significant portion of his fee. "Mr. Blackwood won't accept this easily. He has resources, connections. He has criminal liability," Harrison corrected sharply. "Marriage fraud is a serious offense, as is conspiracy to deprive someone of their liberty. If Mr. Blackwood wishes to pursue this matter further, he's welcome to explain to a federal judge why he thought fake marriages and forged documents were acceptable business practices." The detective mounted his horse with obvious frustration. "This isn't over," he said to Clara. "Blackwood isn't the kind of man who lets go easily." "Then he'll have to learn," Magnus replied, his voice carrying quiet menace. "Because Clara is under my protection now, and I don't let go easily either." After Hayes and his companion rode away, muttering about wasted time and unpaid expenses, an almost supernatural quiet settled over the clearing. Dutch Hansen shook his head in amazement. "In 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything quite like that," he said. Judge Harrison smiled. "The law exists to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Sometimes it just takes a while to sort out which is which." He turned to Clara. "Miss Mitchell, you're free to go wherever you choose, live however you see fit, marry whomever you please. The territorial government recognizes no claim by Edmund Blackwood over your person or property." Clara looked up at Magnus, seeing her own wonder reflected in his eyes. They were free, truly free, to choose their own path forward. "Thank you, Judge Harrison," she said softly. "You've given me back my life. You never lost it, my dear. You just needed the law to catch up with the truth." Harrison remounted his mare, preparing to continue his circuit. "And congratulations, by the way." "For what?" The old judge's eyes twinkled with suppressed humor. "On your upcoming marriage, of course. I'll be back through this area in about 6 months. If you'd like to make things official by then, I'd be honored to perform the ceremony." As he rode away, leaving Clara and Magnus alone with Dutch Hansen, the future stretched before them like an uncharted trail, difficult perhaps, but theirs to travel together. Freedom, Magnus discovered, was more complicated than he had imagined. The revelation of Clara's fraudulent marriage should have solved everything, cleared their names, legitimized their relationship, opened the door to a future together without shame or legal complications. But as winter tightened its grip on the Colorado mountains, new challenges emerged that tested them in ways neither had anticipated. Clara's pregnancy was advancing rapidly now, impossible to hide despite her attempts at discretion. By December, her condition was obvious to anyone who looked, and the implications created a storm of gossip in Cedar Ridge that made the previous whispers seem like gentle breezes. Magnus spread his hand-drawn map across the cabin table, marking routes through the high country that would take them far from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of civilization. The map was a work of art in its own way, decades of exploration reduced to careful lines and notations, showing trails that existed only in his memory and the memories of the few mountain men who had come before him. "This pass here," he said, pointing to a narrow gap between two peaks, "stays clear most of the winter if you know the right approach. Takes you into a valley where there's game, fresh water, shelter from the worst weather." Clara studied the map, her hands resting on her swollen belly. At 7 months pregnant, she moved with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo. "How long would we need to stay hidden?" "Until spring at least, maybe longer, depending on whether Blackwood gives up or doubles down." Magnus traced another route with his finger. "There are places up there where a man could hide for years if he had to. Places where the law, any law, can't reach." But even as he spoke of escape routes and wilderness sanctuaries, Magnus knew they were planning for more than just geographical isolation. They were preparing to become outlaws in the eyes of many, to step outside the boundaries of respectable society and forge their own path through a world that had little patience for unconventional choices. The immediate catalyst came on a bitter December morning when Pastor Morrison arrived at their cabin with a delegation from town. Magnus saw them approaching from a mile away, 6 riders moving up the mountain trail with the purposeful air of men on a mission. He recognized Morrison's distinctive black coat and the rigid posture that never seemed to bend, even in the saddle. "They're coming for us," Clara said quietly, watching from the window as Magnus checked his rifles and ammunition. "Let them come." Magnus's voice carried the cold certainty of a man who had made his peace with violence. "They'll find we're not as helpless as they imagine." The delegation reined in 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to avoid immediate threat. Morrison rode slightly ahead of the others, his role as moral authority clear in his positioning. Behind him were Jake Stevens and 4 other men Magnus recognized from town, all armed, all wearing expressions of righteous determination. "Magnus Thorne," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the theatrical projection he used from his pulpit. "We've come to talk sense into you before this situation goes any further." Magnus stepped onto his porch, Clara beside him, despite his preference that she remain inside. "State your business, preacher." "Our business is the moral health of this community." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Clara's obvious condition. "This woman, this unmarried woman, is carrying a child conceived in sin. Such flagrant immorality cannot be tolerated in a Christian settlement." "Clara and I plan to marry," Magnus replied evenly. "Judge Harrison will perform the ceremony when he returns in the spring." "Marriage after the fact does not erase the sin of fornication," Morrison declared. "Nor does it address the scandal that has already corrupted our young people with its example." Jake Stevens spurred his horse forward, his youth making him bold in ways that experience might have tempered. "What kind of example are you setting, Thorne?" "Living in sin, flaunting your immorality for all to see. The kind of example that says a man protects what he loves," Magnus replied, his hand moving almost casually to rest on the butt of his holstered pistol. "The kind that says some things matter more than the opinions of small-minded fools." The insult hit Jake like a physical blow, and Magnus saw the young man's hand twitch toward his own weapon. But Morrison raised a restraining hand, clearly preferring to maintain his moral authority rather than descend into gunplay. "We're not here for violence," Morrison said, though his eyes suggested otherwise. "We're here with an offer, a chance for redemption." "I'm listening," Magnus said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "The woman comes with us. We'll see her properly cared for until the child is born, then help arrange suitable placement for both mother and infant. You return to your solitary life, away from temptation and corruption." Clara stepped forward, her green eyes blazing with indignation. "I'm not going anywhere with you people. I'm not your property to dispose of." "You're an unmarried woman carrying a bastard child," Stevens snarled. "That makes you everyone's business." The words were barely out of his mouth when Magnus exploded into motion. He covered the distance between porch and horses in 3 long strides, reaching up to drag Stevens from his saddle before the younger man could react. They hit the ground hard, Magnus's superior size and strength making the outcome inevitable. "Magnus, no!" Clara's voice cut through the sound of violence, but Magnus was beyond hearing. Years of suppressed rage, at society's judgment, at Clara's suffering, at his own helplessness in the face of legal and social pressure, poured out in a fury that terrified even him. It took 3 men to pull him off Stevens, and even then Magnus fought against their restraint with the strength of a wounded grizzly. When reason finally returned, he found himself staring at Stevens's bloody face and the shocked expressions of the other men. "This isn't over," Morrison said, his voice shaking with anger and perhaps fear. "This community will not tolerate such behavior indefinitely." "Then maybe it's time for this community to learn some tolerance," Clara replied, moving to Magnus's side despite her advanced pregnancy. "Or maybe it's time for us to find somewhere that deserves our presence." After the delegation rode away, Magnus and Clara stood in the clearing where violence had erupted, both of them understanding that a line had been crossed. The fragile détente between Magnus and Cedar Ridge was broken, probably permanently. That night, Clara found Magnus sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with the expression of a man wrestling with difficult choices. "We can't stay here," she said, settling beside him with the careful movements her condition required. "I know." Magnus reached out to touch her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly beneath his palm. "But running means giving up everything I've built here. This cabin, these mountains, they're all I've ever had." "Not all," Clara corrected gently. "You have me. You have our child. Those are the things that matter, Magnus. The rest is just—" She gestured around the cabin. "The rest is just stuff." Magnus was quiet for a long moment, his hand still resting on her stomach. "Where would we go? How would we live?" Clara had been thinking about this question for weeks, preparing for the moment when running became their only option. "North," she said finally, "into the deep wilderness, beyond the reach of territorial authority. There are places up there where mountain men used to winter, places with shelters already built, game to hunt, streams that don't freeze. And when the baby comes, we'll manage. People have been having babies in wilderness conditions for thousands of years. We have medical supplies, basic knowledge, and each other. That's more than most pioneers started with." Magnus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered peaks that glowed silver in the moonlight. Somewhere up there, beyond the comfortable boundaries of his known territory, lay the kind of freedom that could only be bought with isolation and hardship. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "Winter in the high country is brutal. No guarantees we'll all survive until spring. No guarantees we'll survive here either," Clara pointed out. "Morrison and his followers aren't going to give up. Next time, they might come with territorial marshals or federal authority. Next time, they might not be interested in talking." Magnus turned back to her, seeing determination in her eyes that matched his own. "When do you want to leave?" "Tomorrow, if possible. Before they have time to organize something official." Clara struggled to her feet, one hand braced against her lower back. "I know it's asking a lot, leaving everything you've built, everything you know." "Clara." Magnus crossed to her, taking her hands in his. 16 years ago I lost you because I wasn't strong enough to fight the authorities who wanted to separate us. I won't make that mistake again. Wherever you go, I go. Whatever it costs, we stay together." She rose on her toes to kiss him, a gesture made awkward by her pregnancy, but no less meaningful for its difficulty. "I love you, Magnus Thorne, not as a brother, not as a guardian, but as a man, as the father of my child and the partner of my heart. And I love you, Clara Mitchell, enough to follow you into the wilderness, enough to fight anyone who tries to take you from me, enough to spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." Outside, the wind was picking up, bringing with it the promise of heavy snow. By morning, their tracks would be covered, their destination hidden from anyone who might try to follow. But for now, in the warmth of their cabin, they made final preparations for a journey that would test every skill Magnus had learned in 16 years of mountain life. The map spread across their table showed routes into country that existed beyond the reach of law, civilization, and judgment, country where a man and woman could live by their own rules and raise their children according to their own values. It was country that might kill them, but it was also country that might set them free. The blizzard struck without warning, 3 hours into their escape from Cedar Ridge. Magnus had been watching the sky all morning, reading the signs in cloud formations and wind patterns that spoke of weather moving in from the northwest. But the mountains were notorious for creating their own weather systems, and what should have been a moderate snowfall became a howling maelstrom that reduced visibility to arm's length and turned their planned route into a maze of white death. Clara rode behind, Magnus on their strongest horse, her arms wrapped around his waist for warmth and stability. The pack animals, 2 mules loaded with everything they could carry from their cabin, followed on lead ropes, their heads down against the driving snow. Every few minutes, Magnus had to stop and check their position against landmarks that were increasingly impossible to see. How much farther? Clara shouted over the wind, her voice barely audible despite being inches from his ear. "I don't know," Magnus admitted, a confession that terrified him more than the storm itself. He had never been lost in these mountains, never found himself unable to navigate by instinct and experience. But this blizzard was beyond anything in his memory, a wall of white that erased the familiar world and left them stumbling blind through hostile terrain. That's when Clara's labor pains began. Magnus felt her stiffen behind him, her grip around his waist tightening with sudden intensity. When he turned to look at her, he saw pain etched in every line of her face, the kind of deep, rhythmic agony that could mean only one thing. "Clara, it's starting," she gasped through gritted teeth. "The baby, it's coming." Magnus felt the world tilt around him, panic rising in his throat like bile. Clara wasn't due for another 6 weeks, but stress and hardship could trigger early labor, and they were trapped in the worst possible circumstances for dealing with a medical emergency. "Can you hold on?" he asked, scanning the white void around them for any sign of shelter. "We need to find somewhere protected from the wind." "Magnus." Clara's voice carried an urgency that made his blood freeze. "Look!" Through the swirling snow, barely visible in the chaos of the storm, shapes were moving. Riders, at least 4 of them, following their trail despite the blizzard. Even at this distance, Magnus recognized the determined posture of men who wouldn't be deterred by weather or terrain. Sheriff Dutch Hansen rode point, his badge gleaming dully in the stormlight. Behind him came Pastor Morrison and 3 other men from Cedar Ridge, all bundled against the cold, but carrying weapons that spoke of serious intent. "They followed us," Clara whispered, another contraction making her double over with pain. Magnus urged their horse forward, but the animal was already exhausted from breaking trail through deep snow. The pack mules were moving even slower, their loads making them clumsy and unsteady on the treacherous ground. Their pursuers, traveling light and driven by righteous fury, were gaining ground steadily. Magnus Thorne. Dutch Hansen's voice cut through the storm, amplified by desperation and duty. "Stop where you are. There's a federal marshal riding up from Denver. This has gone beyond local jurisdiction." A federal marshal changed everything. Local politics and personal grudges were one thing, but federal authority carried weight that even the remote mountains couldn't deflect forever. Magnus felt the trap closing around them with the inexorability of winter itself. Clara cried out as another contraction struck, this one stronger and longer than the last. Blood was beginning to stain the snow beneath their horse. A crimson trail that spoke of complications Magnus wasn't equipped to handle in the best of circumstances, let alone in the middle of a blizzard with armed men closing in. "We have to stop," Clara gasped. "I can't. The baby won't wait." Magnus saw a dark smudge against the white that might have been shelter, a rock outcropping or maybe an overhang that could provide minimal protection from the wind. It was their only chance. But reaching it would mean abandoning the mules and most of their supplies. "Hold on," he told Clara, cutting the lead ropes and driving their horse toward the dark promise of shelter. Behind them, the pack animals stood confused in the storm. their loads, representing months of preparation, now abandoned to the elements. The shelter turned out to be a shallow cave, barely large enough for 2 people, but offering crucial protection from the driving snow. Magnus half-carried Clara inside, spreading their remaining blankets on the rocky ground while she fought through contractions that were coming faster now, with an intensity that spoke of imminent birth. "The baby's coming now," Clara panted, her face pale with exhaustion and pain. "I can feel, Magnus, I can't do this. Not here, not like this. Yes, you can," Magnus said firmly, though his own terror threatened to overwhelm him. "We've survived everything else together. We'll survive this too." Outside the cave, the sound of approaching horses grew louder despite the storm. Their pursuers had found them, drawn by the abandoned pack animals and the clear trail in the snow. Soon Magnus would have to choose between protecting Clara during the most vulnerable moment of her life and defending them both from men who viewed their love as a crime worth pursuing into the teeth of a blizzard. The badge sheriff Hansen carried represented law and order, civilization's claim on their lives. But in this cave, with Clara fighting to bring new life into a hostile world, Magnus recognized only one authority, the primal bond between a man and the woman he loved. And the child they had created together, Clara's child, entered the world during the worst blizzard in 20 years. Born in a cave barely large enough for shelter, delivered by a mountain man's rough hands while armed men waited outside in the howling snow. Magnus had delivered calves and foals, helped use through difficult births, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Clara's face contorted with pain and effort, her hand gripping his so tightly he thought his bones might break. The primitive urgency of birth happening, whether the world was ready or not. "I can see the head," he told her, his voice steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. "Clara, you're doing it." Just a little more, she bore down with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so exhausted, and suddenly the baby was there, tiny, blood-covered, but unmistakably alive. A girl, Magnus realized as he cleared the infant's mouth and nose with trembling fingers. The baby's first cry was thin but strong, a sound that seemed to pierce the storm itself. "Is she?" Clara could barely speak, exhaustion having drained her voice to a whisper. "She's perfect," Magnus said, wrapping the baby in his cleanest shirt before placing her in Clara's arms. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that worked just fine. For a moment, the cave was filled with something approaching peace, the quiet wonder of new life, the intimacy of family formed in adversity. Clara's daughter, their daughter now, settled against her mother's chest with the instinctive trust of the newly born. Then Sheriff Hansen's voice shattered the moment. "Magnus, Clara, we know you're in there. Come out so we can talk." Magnus moved to the cave entrance, peering through the blowing snow at the shapes of mounted men arranged in a rough semicircle. The storm was beginning to ease, visibility improving enough to make out individual faces. Dutch Hansen sat his horse with obvious reluctance, while Pastor Morrison radiated righteous satisfaction despite the bitter cold. "Nothing to talk about, Dutch," Magnus called back. "We're not hurting anyone here. You're hurting the moral fabric of our entire community," Morrison shouted, his voice carrying the theatrical intensity he used from his pulpit. "Living in sin, producing bastard children, corrupting everything decent people hold sacred." Magnus felt rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had sustained him through years of solitude and judgment. "The only thing corrupted here is your understanding of what love looks like." "Love?" Morrison's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Is that what you call adultery and fornication? Is that what you call the perversion of family bonds?" "I call it 2 people choosing each other despite a world that wants to keep them apart," Magnus replied. "I call it creating life instead of destroying it." Behind him, Clara stirred on their makeshift bed, the baby fussing softly as she tried to nurse. The sight of his family, vulnerable, exhausted, but undeniably real, filled Magnus with protective instinct that went deeper than law or custom. "The federal marshal will be here within the hour," Hansen called out, his tone carrying genuine regret. "He's got papers, Magnus. Legal authority that goes beyond what I can overlook. Let him come, Magnus said quietly. Let him try to separate a family. But even as he spoke the words, Magnus knew their situation was desperate. Clara couldn't travel. The baby was hours old, and their supplies were scattered across the mountainside with their abandoned pack animals. They were trapped between the storm, the pursuit, and the fundamental vulnerability of new life. That's when Clara spoke from behind him, her voice weak but determined. Magnus, help me up. Clara, you can't help me up, she repeated, struggling to sit despite her exhaustion. If we're going to face them, we face them together. Magnus supported her as she rose unsteadily, the baby cradled in one arm while she leaned heavily against him. Together they appeared at the cave mouth, a family united despite impossible circumstances, love made visible in the midst of hatred and judgment. The sight stopped Morrison's rhetoric mid-sentence. Even through the storm, even at this distance, the power of what they represented was unmistakable. Not sin or corruption, but the oldest story in the world. Two people who had found each other despite every obstacle, who had created something precious together, who would defend that creation with their lives if necessary. Dutch Hansen removed his hat, a gesture of respect that surprised everyone, including himself. Congratulations, he said quietly. The baby, is she healthy? She's perfect, Clara replied, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. And she's ours, Sheriff. Whatever papers your marshal might have, whatever laws he might quote, this child belongs to the people who will love her and raise her and die to protect her if necessary. Pastor Morrison spurred his horse forward, clearly intending to press his moral advantage, while Clara was weakened. But Magnus stepped protectively in front of his family, and something in his posture, the quiet readiness, the absolute commitment, made even the preacher reconsider. This ends now, Magnus said, his voice carrying the finality of winter itself. Clara and I are going to raise our daughter in these mountains, away from people who mistake judgment for righteousness. Anyone who tries to stop us will have to go through me first. The baby's cry pierced the mountain air, a sound that seemed to remind everyone present what they were really fighting about. Not abstract questions of morality or law, but a living child who deserved better than to be born into a world of conflict and condemnation. Spring came early to the Colorado Territory in 1871, melting the snows with unprecedented warmth and revealing a world transformed by the events of that brutal winter. The photograph on Magnus and Clara's mantel showed three people arranged in front of their rebuilt cabin, a tall man with gentle eyes, a woman whose face glowed with quiet contentment, and a baby girl whose presence seemed to justify everything that had come before. Sarah Thorne, they had named her for Clara's birth mother, was 6 months old now, a healthy child with Magnus's dark hair and Clara's green eyes. She gurgled happily in her father's arms as Clara adjusted her dress for the formal portrait. Their first as a legally married family, Judge Harrison had returned in May as promised, performing a ceremony that drew half of Cedar Ridge, despite the lingering controversy surrounding the couple's unconventional courtship. Sarah Mitchell, the store owner who had become Clara's closest friend, stood as witness, while Sheriff Dutch Hansen provided quiet security against any disruption Pastor Morrison might have planned. But Morrison himself was notably absent from the wedding, having departed Cedar Ridge during the harsh winter months after a scandal involving church funds and a married woman from Denver. His replacement, Pastor Williams, was a younger man with a more practical view of frontier life and human nature. Love finds a way, Pastor Williams had said during the ceremony, his eyes twinkling as baby Sarah cooed from Clara's arms. Even when the world tries to stand in its path, even when circumstances seem impossible, love finds a way to create families and build futures worth having. The winter had tested them all. After the confrontation in the cave, the federal marshal had indeed arrived, only to discover that his warrants were based on the fraudulent marriage contract that Judge Harrison had already invalidated. Detective Hayes, it turned out, had failed to inform his employers about the legal complications, hoping to collect his fee before anyone discovered the truth. Edmund Blackwood himself never came to Colorado. Reports filtered back from Boston suggesting he had fled the country ahead of federal charges related to marriage fraud and conspiracy. Clara's freedom was absolute now, her past relegated to painful memories rather than legal complications. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had been slower to accept the new reality. Some, led by the departed Morrison, had viewed Magnus and Clara's relationship as confirmation of their worst suspicions about frontier morality. Others, particularly those with children of their own, found it harder to condemn love that had produced such obvious happiness. The birth of baby Sarah had been the turning point. Something about new life, about a healthy child thriving in the care of devoted parents, had softened even the hardest hearts. When Clara finally came to town with Magnus and their daughter, the reception was warmer than either had expected. Babies have a way of putting things in perspective, Sarah Mitchell had observed, watching her namesake sleep peacefully in Clara's arms. All the moral arguments in the world don't matter much when you're looking at a child who's clearly loved and cared for. Magnus had rebuilt their cabin over the winter, expanding it to accommodate their growing family and the visitors who came more frequently now. The new structure included a proper nursery, a larger kitchen where Clara could work comfortably, and a study where Magnus kept his maps and journals, records of a life lived on his own terms despite society's expectations. The artifacts of their journey were displayed throughout the cabin, like markers of distance traveled and obstacles overcome. Clara's wedding ring from her fraudulent marriage to Blackwood had been melted down and reformed into matching bands for her and Magnus. The carved wooden cross that had symbolized judgment and condemnation now hung beside a painting of the mountains Clara had completed during her pregnancy, art that celebrated the wilderness that had sheltered them. Magnus's father's rifle still held place of honor above the fireplace, but it was joined now by other symbols, baby toys carved from mountain pine, pressed flowers from their wedding bouquet, letters from Judge Harrison congratulating them on their marriage and expressing his pride in helping justice prevail over prejudice. Their economic situation had improved as well. Magnus's reputation as a guide and hunter was enhanced rather than damaged by his willingness to defy convention for love. Wealthy sportsmen from Denver and Colorado Springs sought him out specifically, drawn by stories of the mountain man who had fought both nature and society to protect his family. Clara had started a small business of her own, using her education and writing skills to help other frontier families with correspondence and legal documents. Her experience with fraudulent contracts made her particularly valuable to women seeking to understand their rights and protect their interests. It's strange, Clara mused one evening as they sat on their porch, watching baby Sarah play on a blanket spread across the wooden planks. A year ago, I thought my life was over. I was trapped in a fake marriage, isolated from everyone I loved, convinced that I would never be free to make my own choices. Magnus reached over to take her hand, marveling, as he always did, at how perfectly their fingers intertwined. And now I have everything I ever wanted, and some things I never dared dream of. Clara leaned against his shoulder, watching their daughter discover the fascinating properties of her own toes. A real marriage, a family, a home where we can be ourselves without apology. No regrets. Clara considered the question seriously, as she always did. About leaving Boston, about the scandal we caused, about everything we had to go through to get here. She shook her head. The only thing I regret is how long it took us to understand that we weren't really siblings, that the love between us wasn't forbidden after all. As if responding to her mother's voice, baby Sarah looked up at them both, with the serious expression that reminded Magnus so much of Clara at the same age. But there was something else in the child's eyes, a confidence, perhaps, or simply the security of being born into love rather than obligation. She'll grow up free, Magnus said quietly. Free to choose her own path, love who she wants to love, build whatever life she can imagine, the way we did. The way we did. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded them both of that first morning when Clara had returned to the mountains. But this sunset was different, not an ending, but a beginning, not a moment of reunion, but a promise of tomorrows spent together. Sometimes the bonds that keep us alive are exactly the ones that set us free.